Today I'm going to reveal many useful tips for realistic and physically accurate texturing in Blender 3D, optimization methods for better performance and faster rendering, popular texturing techniques, common mistakes and skills that can make you an absolute beast. So let's get right into it. If you need to make a building in Blender, there is an easy and very effective method on how to make one by using only a single image. First of all, go to Preferences, Add-ons, and Enable Images as Planes. Then import an image of the facade or a building, and in Edit mode, start adding loop cuts and aligning them with the elements and objects on the building. Do this for doors, windows, pipes, frames, and other elements that you think should pop out from the building. With a knife tool, you can cut circular objects, cracks, and other shapes with more complex geometry. Then select the windows and doors and extrude them inwards. Select the frames and extrude them out to make the windows more 3D. Then select other parts and extrude them out. You can easily make extra balconies with this method, and if you see stretched textures after all the extruding, just select them, unwrap them, and reorient them somewhere else. Select windows and assign them as a new material. Add glass BSDF with some bumps and roughness, and with some point light inside you can make a simple interior space. Then plug the building texture into the roughness and bump, duplicate and rotate the building, add a roof, and you just created a building with an interior only from one single image. If your goal is to create realistic renders with realistic materials, just downloading images from Google is not enough, because then the shader that is computing the material would not have enough data to simulate its natural behavior and visual properties. By the way, this is only one of the many issues you will face if you use regular images, but in most cases the image from Google is mostly just a photo of the material with shadows, reflection and height data. The problem is that we want to provide all these visual properties to the shader separately in order to simulate all these characteristics based on where the light source is in our scene. This can be done with a special set of textures called PBR materials. PBR materials are made out of multiple image textures, where each texture contains data about one property of the material. You can easily add them to the viewport and just connect them into the shader one by one, or you can enable Node Wrangler, and with Ctrl-Shift-T you can open a file browser where you can locate the folder with all the textures, select them, and import them automatically all at once. I made a separate video about these materials which I really recommend, especially if you are a person who's taking 3D seriously and not just for fun. Here I explain what the individual maps do, how they work, and where you can find them. But generally speaking, you should use this method every time you need to achieve realistic renders. We will stick with PBR materials for a minute because there is still one small issue with them. I mean, there are so many both free and paid online libraries, but what if you want to use a specific one that you cannot find anywhere? Well, you can create these materials on your own. They probably won't be as accurate as those made by professionals, but there are ways how you can create your own PBR materials faster and for free. Some methods are very accurate but really hard to do because the process requires expensive tools and because the process is very time consuming as well. But due to the technological AI advancements, there are many free online tools that allow you to create whole PBR sets only from one single image. One of these websites is texturesdigimons.ai, where you just upload a photo of the material and you will get a folder with the ambient occlusion map, color map, displacement map, normal map, and the roughness map. The only downside is that the resolution is really bad, so the solution to this might be another alternative, which is for example a texture forge, where you describe the material you want to generate. You will choose the category, the condition, and specify the material in details. Then the website will take all that information you provided, and based on that it will create custom material for you. There are also paid tools like Substance Sampler, Substance Painter, and Designer from Adobe, but if you want a free alternative, you can use Materialize software, which is very easy to use even for non-experienced users. Here you can import the image and generate PBR maps that you can later export and use in your projects. You can make your material even more realistic by using the full power of texture painting in your favor. Texture painting is a very useful method for adding additional detail, storytelling, and variation to your renders. For example, you can use two variations of the same material and blend them together with Mix Shader, creating a new image texture with a black canvas and connecting it to the factor. Then you can blend them together by painting on the image texture with the texture paint tools, which will make the material richer in detail and more visually appealing. You can also use different brushes to randomize the stroke and randomize the pattern, which will make the mask layers less artificial. Another good example of the usefulness of texture painting is that you can add multiple layers on top of each other and create damaged objects. You can do this with image textures, but also with procedural textures if you are creating procedural materials. The things you can do with texture painting are basically unlimited, and it is totally up to you how you use this feature to your advantage. I personally use texture painting to add damage and imperfections to the object, because the part of understanding realism is that every material has some level of imperfection, which makes it less attractive, but it gives you more visual context about what happened to the material in the past, and helps to make the material look less boring. That is why in product visualization or commercial space, the product often needs to look brand new without any visual imperfections, because it needs to attract the client's eye, but in most cases texture painting is a very useful method for making your materials more interesting. Let's talk about how to fake detail in your renders. It's common knowledge that the more geometry you have, the slower the rendering will be, which is something that is hard to avoid when you are creating close-up renders, where details are necessary, but for distant objects you don't need the same amount of geometry because the detail will be lost anyways. For example, trees are very complex objects, and they usually require a lot of geometry to match the complex shape and proportions and to display all necessary details. But if you want to add trees to the background, then instead of a 3D tree that has 50,000 polygons, you can just download a PNG file of a tree from the internet and import the image as a plane to the scene. Once you make sure that the alpha is connected to the alpha channel and the blend more in material properties is set to any of these settings, you can have the same result as if you were using a 3D object, with the exception that you are only using 4 vertices, which is an insane difference. Of course, this depends on the scene, the conditions, the distance from the camera, whether the object is in focus or not, and other factors. But the crazy thing about this method is that you can create a whole forest by using one single image and still use less geometry than by using one 3D asset. It is the best method for static renders since there is no camera movement that would expose the fact that it's a 2D image. But it can also work with animations as well, where you put high poly 3D assets in the foreground and images in the background. By the way, you can also do this with volumes like dust, clouds, or fog. So keep this in mind, because this way you can save hours, days, or maybe even weeks of render time. We already talked about PBR maps and image textures at the beginning of this video, but what I haven't mentioned about them is that they are also seamless, meaning that when you tile them you won't see any hard seams, because the sides perfectly align with the start and the end. And this is very useful, because sometimes you might want to tile the texture to make the material bigger and match the size with other objects. But even though the textures are seamless, you will still observe a repeating pattern of the texture if you tile it many times. Of course, this is a problem, because that's not what real materials look like, so here are 3 ways how to fix this. The first one is the most simple one, and it is by using an Uber mapping node group made by Andrew Price. He made this node specifically for this purpose, so I really need to give credit to him, because I know how many people, including me, were struggling because of this issue. You can find the link with the blend file in the description under this video. After downloading it, open your project and append the node group from the downloaded Blender file. Then go to the shader editor and substitute the mapping node for the Uber mapping node group, and if you adjust the mosaic rotation, the node will randomize the rotation and get rid of the noticeable repetition. Now this method is very effective and it will serve well in most cases, but the problem is that this node cannot be used for certain types of materials like bricks, planks, and other materials with defined lines. So let me introduce you to the second option, which is using procedural texture blending. Procedural textures are the perfect source of randomness, which is exactly what we need in order to mask out the repetition. You can, for example, use a noise texture, mix it with the base color, and set the blend mode to color burn, which will blend the procedural texture and the image texture perfectly. You can also use the noise texture to adjust the hue and make different color variations on different spots, which can also help to distract the viewer from the repeating pattern. The last method that can be used to hide the repetition is again by texture painting. If you mix 2 different materials together, you can paint them together in a way that the tiling won't be even noticeable. Adding grunge, leaks, cracks, paint, and other layers will help as well. Sometimes additional details or elements can help to tell a story or to bring attention to a certain part of the render. I am talking about paintings, signs, graffiti, stickers, and basically everything that can be overlaid or layered on top of the material. If you want to add graffiti to a wall or any custom image texture, just add the image texture. Then connect it to the mapping node, change the mode to clip, and use the image texture as a factor between 2 materials. In this case, I am using a graffiti texture as a mask between brick and black paint material, so the paint appears only where the graffiti is. Did you know that you can use ambient occlusion to add transitions and blend multiple objects together? Let's say you have pavement and a wall next to each other. When you look at the reference photos, there is mostly some sort of grunge, leak, or layer of dirt in the corner where these 2 objects meet. Not only does it add details, but it also blends the pavement and the wall together. And something similar can also be done in shading with the ambient occlusion node. If you multiply the ambient occlusion with the base color by using the mix node, the corner areas will become darker. You can also use it as a mask for a texture, or you can mix it with procedural textures to get more varied results. It is way faster and easier than texture painting, and most importantly, you can procedurally adjust the parameters and make infinite variations. Most materials come with a height map, which is an image texture that provides information about the surface elevation and which is being used to displace the geometry. The problem is that displacement is quite computationally expensive, and it requires a lot of geometry in order to displace the surface, which of course will drastically increase the render time. But there is a very effective solution. Most people just add subdivision surface modifier to the object in order to get more geometry for the displacement, which is fine, but if you switch the feature set to experimental, Blender will enable a new feature called adaptive subdivision. Essentially, this feature will adjust the amount of subdivisions on the mesh based on the distance from the camera. The areas closer to the camera will receive more subdivisions because that's the part that is usually in focus and requires a lot of geometry to display the details. The further you go from the camera, the weaker the subdivision will be because we don't need the same amount of detail everywhere. The results are speaking for themselves, and you will actually get even more detailed displacement, because most of the geometry is concentrated in one place. To set up this feature, you need to first switch the feature set to experimental, because for some reason this option is still not available by default. Then go to render properties, and in the subdivision section you will select your active camera as the dicing camera. Then add the subdivision surface and check adaptive subdivision. Pretty cool, right? Did you know that you can control the size and rotation of any material outside of the shader editor even when you are in object mode? Instead of scaling the material by scaling the UV map or the scale vector in the mapping node, you can control the texture transform by using other objects like empty, which is a special object type that is not visible in the render. Just go to the shading tab and change the coordinates to object. Then select the object you want to use to control the texture in this small box located in the right bottom corner in the texture coordinate node. I will use the empty, but this is totally up to you what object you use. Now, whatever transformation you do to the empty, it will also apply the transformation to the material, which is helpful if you want to, for example, quickly relocate the texture or change its size. If you are using ultra high resolution image textures in your materials and you feel like you don't need that much detail, you can actually decrease the resolution and optimize the rendering performance, which will drastically speed up the build-up and the rendering process. To do this, go to Render Properties, and if you scroll down, you will see this little checkbox that says Simplify. Here you can choose the maximum resolution both for the viewport and for the render. Just a reminder, if you don't see this resolution menu, it's because you are not in Cycles. For some reason this option is still not available for Eevee, but this may change in future versions of Blender. Now the reason why I'm telling you this is because some people tend to often use materials with 8K image textures because they think that the higher the resolution, the more detail they get in the renders. And in some cases this is okay. I also use 8K image textures from time to time when I do very close-up renders. But the thing is, at this point you cannot tell the difference between 4K and 8K textures, especially if the object is further from the camera or when it's out of focus. And even though the 8K texture is only twice the size of the 4K texture, it uses 4 times more memory, which is insane. And if you are, for example, rendering an animation, only this single optimization can save you literally hours of render time, and it will give you basically the same result without any noticeable differences. So next time, when you choose texture resolution, just ask yourself if you really need that much detail. Hopefully you took some value from this video. And if you are a 3D artist who wants to elevate his skill and learn ways and methods on how to improve your renders, make sure to subscribe to my channel and join the 10,000 ambitious artists. I am really glad for your support, guys. I appreciate you so much. Also, I have been working on something big for the past 6 months, and it's probably the biggest project I have ever done. I don't want to spoil it, but stay tuned because I think this will be huge. That's all from me. If you want to give me some topic ideas, write a comment, like and share, and I will see you in the next video.